When the Federal Reserve spoke, nothing dramatic happened. No emergency announcement, no sudden policy shift, no urgent press conference. But the tone changed. And in markets, tone is everything. Because when the people controlling the cost of money stop sounding certain, everyone else starts listening more carefully. Jerome Powell didn't say the economy was in trouble. He didn't warn of collapse. He didn't signal panic. What he did was more subtle. He stopped offering reassurance. And that silence was enough. Within weeks, behavior began to change. Not in headlines, in hesitation. In the way lenders paused, in the way buyers waited, in the way deals slowed without explanation. That's when something unusual started to happen across the housing market. Not a crash, not a correction, a quiet recalibration. They didn't hear the sound at first. That was the strange part. Because when it finally registered, people couldn't agree on when it had started, only that something had changed. There was no bang, no crash, no single moment you could point to and say that's when it happened. Just quiet. A silence that crept in slowly, the way pressure builds deep underwater. At first, it showed up in small places. A buyer hesitating on a contract they'd already approved. A lender asking for one more document, then another. A deal that should have closed in 3 weeks stretching into 6. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but enough to feel wrong. And the strange part was, it wasn't isolated. It happened in Austin, then Dallas, then Tampa, then Phoenix. Different markets, different buyers, same behavior. People weren't panicking, they were pausing. And that pause spread. In Austin, homes that once sold in a weekend began sitting quietly. Not abandoned, just waiting. In Dallas suburbs, properties that would have sparked bidding wars were suddenly open for weeks, a shift worth paying attention to if you subscribe early. In Florida, real estate agents started hearing the same phrase over and over again, "We're just going to wait and see." That sentence became the most expensive phrase in the market. Because when people stop acting, momentum dies. And markets run on momentum. The strange thing was, nothing looked wrong on paper. Jobs were still there. Wages hadn't collapsed. New construction continued. But behind the numbers, behavior was changing. Buyers weren't afraid of losing money. They were afraid of making the wrong decision at the wrong time. A subtle difference, but a powerful one. When people fear loss, they panic. When they fear regret, they freeze. And freezing spreads faster than panic ever could. Inside banks and lending offices, that same hesitation began to surface. Loan officers became more cautious. Underwriters reviewed files more closely. Small inconsistencies that would have been overlooked months earlier suddenly mattered. Not because of policy changes, because of uncertainty. No one wanted to be the person who approved a loan right before conditions shifted. So approval slowed, not officially, not on paper, but in practice. And when credit slows, even slightly, everything downstream feels it. At the same time, something else changed. Developers began quietly delaying projects, not canceling them, just waiting. Waiting for clarity, waiting for direction, waiting to see who moved first. And this is where the psychology turns dangerous. Because markets don't need bad news to stall. They only need hesitation. What made this moment different from past slowdowns was the absence of a villain. No housing bubble popping, no banking collapse, no single event to blame. Just a growing sense that the rules had shifted, and no one had explained how. People could feel it, but they couldn't articulate it. And when people can't explain what they're feeling, they default to caution. This is the phase most people never notice. The space between confidence and collapse. The pause before momentum flips direction. It's quiet, uncomfortable, easy to dismiss, until suddenly, it isn't. Because once enough people hesitate at the same time, the system behaves differently. Prices stop moving the way they used to. Demand stops responding the way it always has. And certainty, The invisible fuel of every market begins to evaporate. That's when the shift becomes real, just undeniable. And by the time it's obvious to everyone, it's already too late to pretend nothing changed. And then something subtle happened, not in housing data, but in the language coming out of Washington. When the Federal Reserve spoke, the words were familiar, but the tone wasn't. Jerome Powell didn't sound alarmed. He didn't sound confident either. He spoke carefully, measured, as if every sentence carried weight beyond what he could say out loud. Inflation was progressing. Rates would remain restrictive for some time. Policy would be data-dependent. On paper, nothing changed. But to markets, that shift in tone meant everything. Because when the Fed stops signaling relief, it's not guidance anymore. It's a warning. From that moment on, the hesitation hardened. Lenders began modeling risk differently. Not drastically, just enough. Loan officers were told to take a second look. Underwriters were encouraged to be conservative. Those words sound harmless. But in finance, they translate to one thing: slow down. Files sat longer. Approvals stretched. Conditions piled up. Not because borrowers were weaker, but because confidence was. And once that doubt enters the system, it spreads quietly. At the same time, the psychology of buyers began to change. People weren't asking, "Can I afford this?" They were asking, "What if I'm wrong? What if rates don't come down? What if prices drift lower after I buy? What if this isn't the bottom, just the pause before something else?" Those questions didn't show up in headlines. They showed up in behavior, in canceled showings, in second thoughts, in deals that hovered just short of the finish line. The market didn't collapse, it hesitated. And hesitation is contagious. Then came the data that made analysts uneasy. Not dramatic numbers, subtle ones. Days on market creeping higher across major metros. Inventory rising, not fast, but steadily. Price cuts increasing, quietly, listing by listing. In places like Dallas, Tampa, and Phoenix, new listings outpaced closed sales for the first time in years. Not a crash, a shift. And the most telling sign? Builders stopped racing each other. They slowed releases, delayed phases, quietly pushed timelines back. Not because demand vanished, but because conviction did. This is where the story changes. Because once the market enters this phase, logic alone doesn't drive it anymore. Psychology does. People stop asking, "Is this a good deal?" and start asking, "What if I'm early?" And that single question can freeze an entire system. Because nobody wants to be first into uncertainty. Everyone waits for someone else to move. And while they wait, momentum drains out of the market. The irony is this: nothing technically broke. Employment remained strong. Rates stabilized. The economy kept growing. But belief, the belief that housing always moves forward, began to fracture. And once belief cracks, behavior changes long before data does. That's why this moment feels so strange. There's no panic, no headlines screaming disaster, just a slow, quiet recalibration of expectations. A collective recalculation happening in real time. This is the phase most people misunderstand. They think the danger is a crash. It's not. The real danger is stagnation. When activity slows, confidence thins, and momentum fades without anyone noticing. Because stagnation doesn't announce itself. It seeps in. One delayed decision at a time. One cautious lender. One hesitant buyer. One seller who decides to wait until spring. And when enough people do that simultaneously, the market doesn't fall. It drifts. That's why this moment matters. Not because of what's already happened, but because of what hasn't happened yet. The real shift isn't in prices. It's in psychology. And psychology moves first. By the time the numbers confirm it, the window has already passed. So if something feels different right now, if the silence feels heavier than usual, you're not imagining it. You're noticing the space between certainty and change. The moment where attention matters most. the space where the next phase always begins, before the silence turns into headlines for everyone else. So subscribe while you're already ahead of it.